My stepson's new girlfriend was wearing my missing lingerie at family brunch. I had always prided myself on being the kind of woman who noticed things. The slight shift in a dinner guest's expression when conversation turned uncomfortable, the way my daughter Maya would twist her garnet ring counterclockwise when she was anxious, the particular quality of silence that filled our Beacon Hill brownstone when my husband David was working through a difficult case in his mind. But somehow inexplicably, I had failed to notice that someone had been slowly, methodically stealing pieces of my most intimate wardrobe over the course of 8 weeks. And that failure of observation would come crashing down on me during what was supposed to be a perfectly pleasant Sunday brunch on the first genuinely warm morning of a Boston spring that had taken its sweet time arriving. The missing items had started as a mystery so mundane that I had barely registered it as a mystery at all, just one of those small domestic irritations that women are expected to absorb without comment. My favorite La Perla bodysuit, the black one with the delicate French lace that made me feel like the woman I had been before my first marriage dissolved into recriminations in separate bedrooms, had simply vanished from my lingerie drawer sometime in early March. I had searched through the laundry, questioned our housekeeper Rosa with the kind of careful casualness that wouldn't make her feel accused, and finally convinced myself that I must have packed it away in some forgotten corner during my winter closet reorganization. Though even as I constructed this explanation I felt the faint pulse of unease that comes when you're lying to yourself, and you know it but you do it anyway because the truth seems too strange or too troubling to entertain. Then the burgundy silk chemise disappeared, the one I had bought in Paris during my honeymoon with David, when we were still in that golden phase of remarriage where everything felt possible and uncomplicated, where his children and my daughter seemed like they might actually blend into something resembling a functional family rather than a collection of individuals performing the roles they thought they were supposed to play. After that came the vintage slip my mother had given me, champagne-colored silk so delicate it felt like water between your fingers, with hand-tatted lace at the hem and my monogram embroidered on the inside label in thread the color of old gold. And that loss had felt different, more personal, because it carried the weight of memory and maternal love. And when I couldn't find it anywhere I had actually cried, standing alone in my walk-in closet in the middle of the afternoon, feeling ridiculous and hormonal and convinced that I was losing my mind in the way that women of a certain age are always afraid they might be losing their minds. I had even gone so far as to make a list in the Notes app on my phone, cataloging each missing piece with descriptions detailed enough that I could have filed a police report. Though of course I never would because can you imagine calling the Boston Police Department to report stolen lingerie? Can you imagine the patronizing tone in the officer's voice as he tried to determine whether this was a real complaint or the fevered imagination of a middle-aged woman who had simply misplaced her undergarments and was too proud to admit it? The list had grown to 7 items by the morning of the brunch, 7 carefully chosen, expensive pieces that represented not just money, though they did represent money, quite a lot of it when you added everything together, but also a particular vision of myself that I maintained in private, a vision that had nothing to do with being a stepmother or a wife or an art gallery curator or any of the roles I inhabited in public, a vision that was just mine, just for me, the secret architecture of selfhood that women construct beneath their clothes. The brunch had been David's idea originally, these monthly family gatherings that he insisted would help us all bond and stay connected. Though what they really did was create a stage upon which we all performed our designated roles with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skill. David as the benevolent patriarch who had successfully navigated divorce and remarriage without too much damage to anyone's psyche, me as the gracious second wife who harbored no resentment about being compared to Amanda, his elegant, perpetually absent first wife who had decamped to California and seemed to become more perfect in memory the longer she stayed away. Maya as my loyal daughter who tried valiantly to accept her new stepfather and stepbrother without completely abandoning her allegiance to her own father, and James as the dutiful son who treated me with unfailing politeness while maintaining just enough distance to make it clear that I was not, would never be, could never be his mother in any way that actually mattered. But this particular Sunday was supposed to be special because James had called 3 days earlier, his voice carrying that particular brightness that meant he was either excited about a promotion or excited about a woman, and he had announced that he was bringing his new girlfriend to meet everyone, a development that had sent David into paroxysms of joy because he interpreted any girlfriend as a sign that his son was settling down and becoming serious about life, though James is romantic. History suggested that his girlfriends appeared and disappeared with seasonal regularity, each one younger and more impulsive than the last, each one convinced that she would be the one to transform him from an overgrown boy who worked in tech and played video games into a proper adult man with wedding plans and mortgage considerations. I had spent the morning preparing an elaborate spread that represented my anxiety translated into culinary form. A mushroom and Gruyere quiche with a crust so perfectly flaky it had taken me 45 minutes of careful meditative effort. Fresh pastries from the French bakery on Charles Street that required me to wake at 6:30 and drive through empty streets still wet with morning dew. A fruit salad arranged in concentric circles of color that probably no one would notice but that made me feel like I was demonstrating some essential competence. Mimosas with freshly squeezed orange juice and strawberries frozen specially for the purpose. And a complex egg dish that I had seen in a cooking magazine and that seemed, in the planning stages, like it would convey sophistication and effort without seeming like I was trying too hard. Though of course I was trying too hard. I was always trying too hard, because that's what second wives do. We try to demonstrate our worth through perfect tablescapes and thoughtfully curated gatherings, and the kind of effortless hospitality that actually requires enormous effort to maintain. Maya had arrived early to help, letting herself in with her key and finding me in the kitchen arranging flowers in the Waterford vase that had been a wedding gift from David's mother, an heirloom that carried the weight of family approval and the implicit expectation that I would be worthy of it. And my daughter had taken one look at my face and said, "Mom, you need to breathe and stop acting like you're hosting a state dinner for someone who's probably going to last 6 weeks maximum." Which was both accurate and unhelpful, because I knew I was being ridiculous but I couldn't seem to stop myself. Couldn't seem to shake the feeling that every interaction with James carried the potential for me to be measured against his real mother, and found wanting in ways both obvious and subtle. The morning had been perfect in that crystalline way that Boston springs can be when they finally arrive after months of gray slush and bitter wind. The kind of morning where the light seems to have texture and weight, where the flowering trees in our small brick-walled garden were performing their brief annual miracle of pink and white blossoms, where you could almost believe that the world was a gentle place filled with gentle people, and that nothing bad or strange or disturbing could possibly happen on such a day. And I had been setting wine glasses on the outdoor table on our patio when I heard the doorbell ring with its familiar melodic chime, followed by David's booming voice welcoming his son, followed by another voice, female, bright with performance, saying something I couldn't quite hear but that made the men laugh. I had wiped my hands on a dish towel, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror with the kind of quick, assessing glance that women give themselves before meeting potential rivals or judges, noting that my hair was behaving itself for once and that the linen shirt dress I had chosen struck the right balance between casual and elegant, between trying and not trying, between being the kind of stepmother who makes an effort and the kind who makes too much effort. And then I had walked through the French doors into the living room with what I hoped was a warm, welcoming smile on my face. The kind of smile that said I was delighted to meet this new girlfriend and harbored no reservations or judgments whatsoever. James stood by the fireplace looking proud and nervous in the way that young men do when they're introducing someone they're sleeping with to their parents, wearing jeans and a button-down shirt that was probably supposed to represent him making an effort. And beside him stood a petite woman with glossy black hair cut in a sharp bob, wearing an oversized blazer and camel over what I assumed was a dress or a top of some kind, her entire aesthetic suggesting someone who had studied fashion influencers very carefully and had learned how to curate an image that read as effortlessly cool, while actually being the result of considerable calculation and expense. "Kate, this is Brooklyn," James said, using the slightly formal tone he always employed when addressing me, as though we were colleagues at a business conference rather than people who lived in connected family units. "But everyone calls her Brooke." And Brooke stepped forward with her hand extended and a smile that showed very white, very straight teeth. And I shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and her nails were painted the exact shade of ballet pink that I favored, though this could have been coincidence, probably was coincidence, and she said, "It's so wonderful to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you. And I just love what you've done with the living room. The color palette is absolutely perfect." The comment about the living room stopped me for just a fraction of a second because it was oddly specific, oddly intimate. Not the kind of thing you'd say upon entering a house for the first time, but rather the kind of thing you'd say if you'd been thinking about the living room for a while, if you'd been considering its design choices and had formed opinions about them. But I dismissed this thought as paranoia born of my general anxiety about the occasion, and said something gracious about how wonderful it was to meet her too, how James had told us so little about her that we were dying of curiosity. And she laughed in that performative way that suggested she was used to being watched, used to calibrating her responses for an audience that might or might not be present. We moved through the morning's choreography of small talk and food presentation and the careful dance of strangers trying to find common ground. And I noticed things about Brooke in the way that women notice things about other women, cataloging details that might or might not be significant. The way she touched James's arm possessively every few minutes, the way she seemed to know where the bathroom was without being told, the way she complimented specific objects in our house with the kind of detailed observation that suggested familiarity rather than first impressions, the way she called Rosa by name when our housekeeper came through to collect some dishes even though I was certain I hadn't introduced them, the way she mentioned that she loved the particular brand of coffee we were serving even though it was an obscure Italian roast that I special ordered online and that wasn't visible in its packaging. But it wasn't until we were all seated at the patio table, until the mimosas were poured and the quiche was served and the morning sun had grown warm enough that Brooke said, "God, it's beautiful out here but I'm absolutely melting," and stood up and shrugged off her oversized blazer with a fluid motion that seemed designed to draw attention, that I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach, and the world tilt sideways in that way it does when you suddenly understand that something is terribly, fundamentally wrong, because underneath that blazer Brooke was wearing a champagne-colored silk camisole with hand-tatted lace at the hem, and even from across the table I could see the delicate stitching, could recognize the particular way the silk caught the light, could identify with absolute certainty that she was wearing my missing vintage slip, my mother's gift, the one with my monogram embroidered on the inside in thread the color of old gold. And as she leaned forward to reach for a pastry I caught a glimpse of those initials, Sim Catherine Morrison, visible just above the neckline where the label must have been folded over, and I felt my hand begin to tremble so badly that I had to set down my coffee cup before I dropped it, because I was suddenly absolutely certain that I was sitting across from a woman who had been inside my bedroom, inside my closet, inside my most private spaces, wearing my most intimate clothing, and she was smiling at me with those very white, very straight teeth as though nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. 6 months had passed since that terrible Sunday when my world had fractured like dropped crystal, scattering into 1,000 sharp pieces that I was still, even now, carefully gathering and attempting to fit back together into something resembling the life I had known before, though I understood with the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from having your illusions systematically destroyed that the reassembled version would never quite match the original, would always carry the visible seams and hairline cracks of something broken and repaired rather than something whole and untouched by trauma. The monthly family brunch had continued, because David believed deeply in the power of ritual and continuity to heal wounds that might otherwise fester in silence and avoidance, and I had agreed to maintain the tradition partly because I understood his reasoning and partly because I refused to let what Brooke had done to me, the violation, the theft, the calculated infiltration of my most private spaces, permanently alter the rhythms of my family life, refused to give her that much power over the architecture of my days even though I knew, with a clarity that sometimes woke me in the middle of the night, that she had already taken something from me that could never be fully restored, namely the sense of absolute safety I had once felt within the walls of my own home. It was early October now, that brief golden window when New England decides to show off before the long descent into winter darkness, and the garden was performing its autumn transformation with characteristic New England restraint, the leaves turning colors that seemed more thoughtful than flamboyant, more contemplative than celebratory, and I was setting the table on the patio for what might be the last outdoor brunch of the season when I heard James's voice calling from inside the house, announcing his arrival with a tentative cheerfulness that had become his default tone in the months since the Brooke disaster, as we had all come to call it in the shorthand language that families develop for events too complex and painful to fully articulate every time they need to be referenced. He emerged onto the patio followed by a woman I hadn't met before, though he had mentioned her name, Sarah, something solid and unpretentious about it, during our last phone conversation, and I felt myself automatically tensing in the way I now tensed whenever James brought anyone new into our orbit, my body remembering the violation even as my mind tried to practice the openness and trust that my therapist kept insisting was necessary for healing, necessary for moving forward, necessary for not letting one deeply disturbed young woman's obsessive behavior permanently warp my ability to connect with the people in my stepson's life who might actually be healthy and appropriate and deserving of welcome. Sarah was tall and athletic-looking, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that suggested she hadn't spent hours agonizing over her appearance, and when James introduced us she met my eyes directly and said, Mrs. Morrison, thank you so much for having me. James has told me about what happened with his last girlfriend, and I just want you to know that I completely understand if you need time to feel comfortable with me being here. And I promise I'm just a normal person who thinks breaking into people's homes and stealing their clothes is absolutely insane behavior. And the directness of this, the refusal to pretend that the elephant wasn't sitting right there on the patio with us, made something in my chest loosen slightly, made me think that perhaps James had actually learned something from the catastrophe of Brooke, had perhaps developed some capacity for choosing women based on their character rather than their willingness to reflect his image of himself back to him in flattering and uncritical ways. David appeared with Maya right behind him, my daughter having driven in from her apartment in Somerville where she was living with 2 roommates and working at a non-profit that advocated for affordable housing, and the relief I felt at seeing her face was immediate and visceral, because Maya had become my anchor during those terrible weeks after the confrontation with Brooke, had been the one to sit with me while I cried angry, bewildered tears about the violation, had been the one to help me go through every item in my closet and catalog what was missing, had been the one to hold my hand while I gave a statement to the police about the Instagram photos and the break-ins, though in the end we had decided not to press charges after Brooke's parents had called, desperate and apologetic, explaining that their daughter was receiving intensive psychiatric treatment, and that prosecuting her would likely derail her recovery without actually providing any real justice or restitution. The brunch unfolded with the careful choreography of people who have learned through painful experience where the landmines are buried and how to step around them without triggering explosions, and I found myself watching Sarah with an attention that I knew was probably excessive but couldn't quite stop, looking for signs of the obsessive studying that Brooke had engaged in, the too detailed knowledge of our household, the appropriation of my aesthetic choices and personal preferences, but Sarah seemed genuinely uninterested in anything except James and the conversation and the food, seemed to possess that quality of being comfortably herself that truly confident people have, that quality that doesn't require them to borrow or steal or appropriate anyone else's identity because they're content with their own. James caught my eye at one point while Sarah was talking to Maya about some documentary they'd both seen, and he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod that I understood to mean he recognized what I was doing, recognized my hypervigilance and anxiety, and was trying to communicate that this time was different, this time was better, this time he had actually vetted the person he was bringing into our lives instead of just falling for a pretty face and an exciting Instagram aesthetic, and I nodded back, a gesture of acknowledgement if not quite trust, a gesture that said I saw his effort even if I couldn't yet fully lower my guard. David presided over the gathering with visible pleasure, his faith in the healing power of continued connection vindicated by the fact that we were all here together, still functioning as something resembling a family despite everything that had happened, and I felt a surge of affection for him mixed with a residual frustration that he still didn't quite understand the depth of what Brooke's violation had meant to me, how it had felt to discover that a stranger had been inhabiting my most intimate spaces, wearing my most private garments, constructing an identity from the pieces of mine she had stolen like a magpie building a nest from shiny things taken from other birds. After we had eaten and the conversation had settled into that comfortable low hum that comes when people have been together long enough to not need to fill every silence with noise, I excused myself and went upstairs to my bedroom, something I still did periodically during these gatherings because I needed to physically confirm that everything was as I had left it, needed to check that the locks we had installed were still secure, needed to reassure myself that my space remained my own even though my therapist kept gently suggesting that this compulsive checking was preventing me from truly healing, was keeping the trauma alive by constantly rehearsing my fear instead of learning to trust again in the basic security of my environment. The bedroom was exactly as I had left it that morning, the bed made with the new linens I had purchased to replace everything that Brooke had touched or photographed or contaminated with her obsessive attention, the closet organized with a precision that was probably excessive but that made me feel like I had some control over my domain, and I walked to the window and looked down at the patio where my family was gathered, looking from this angle like a perfectly normal collection of people, enjoying a perfectly normal autumn morning together. No visible signs of the fractures and repairs that I knew existed beneath the surface of our interactions. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Maya standing in the doorway, and without speaking she came and stood beside me at the window, her shoulder touching mine in that casual way that daughters and mothers who are close can occupy space together, and we watched the scene below in silence for a moment before she said, "Sarah seems normal, like genuinely normal." Like the kind of person who has her own life and her own identity and doesn't need to steal anyone else's. And I felt tears prick my eyes because Maya understood what I needed to hear, understood that I was still afraid of letting anyone new into our orbit, still afraid that I had somehow invited Brooke's obsession by being too visible, too open, too much myself in ways that apparently could inspire the kind of distorted admiration that curdles into something dark and appropriative. I'm trying to trust again, I told her, my voice catching slightly on the words. I'm trying to believe that what happened with Brooke was an aberration, was the result of her specific pathology rather than something I did wrong or some flaw in how I exist in the world. But it's hard, Maya. It's so hard to feel safe in your own house when you know that someone was able to enter it repeatedly, was able to study you like you were an exhibit in a museum, was able to take pieces of you and wear them like a costume while you had no idea any of it was happening. Maya turned and pulled me into a hug, and I let myself lean into her solidness, let myself take comfort from the fact that I had raised this fierce, loyal, perceptive young woman who had stood by me through the worst of the Brooke aftermath, who had helped me report the Instagram photos and document the violations, who had sat with me through panic attacks and rage spirals and the grief that comes from having your sense of privacy and safety shattered. And I thought about how trauma changes you, but doesn't have to define you, how you can be wounded and still whole, how you can carry scars and still be beautiful. You didn't do anything wrong, Maya said firmly, pulling back to look at me directly. You were just living your life, being yourself, existing in your own home, and some damaged person fixated on you because she saw in you something she wished she could be. And that's not your fault, Mom. That's not something you could have prevented or anticipated or protected yourself against. And you need to stop punishing yourself by being afraid to be visible, afraid to be fully yourself, afraid to inhabit your own life with the confidence and presence that you had before any of this happened. We returned to the patio together, and I settled back into the conversation with a sense of being held by something larger than just my individual anxiety, held by the network of care and attention that my family had woven around me in the months since the violation, and I found myself actually relaxing enough to enjoy Sarah's company, to appreciate her straightforward humor and obvious intelligence, to entertain the possibility that James might actually be growing up, might actually be learning to choose partners based on substance rather than surface, might actually be becoming the kind of man who could build something real and lasting instead of just cycling through women who served as accessories to his self-image. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to take on that particular golden quality that comes before sunset, I found myself thinking about Brooke for the first time in weeks without the immediate surge of anger and violation that usually accompanied thoughts of her, found myself instead feeling something closer to a complicated sadness for the girl she had been, so desperate for connection and identity that she had resorted to literally stealing mine, so damaged by whatever had happened in her childhood, the absent mother, the recent loss of her grandmother, the foundational wounds that apparently left her unable to construct a coherent self, that she had convinced herself that infiltrating my life, appropriating my aesthetic, wearing my most intimate clothing was somehow a path to becoming whole. I had received one more communication from her, forwarded through her therapist with multiple permissions and disclaimers, a letter written in careful, probably supervised language that apologized without making excuses, that acknowledged the severity of her violation without asking for forgiveness, that explained without justifying that she had seen in me some idealized version of the mother she had lost and had become obsessed with the idea of not just being like me but actually being me, inhabiting my life, wearing my identity like a garment that might transform her into someone worthy and loved and whole. And reading it I had felt not just anger but also a deep uncomfortable recognition that we are all, in our various ways, trying to construct selves from available materials, trying to become people we can live with, trying to fill the holes that life and loss and trauma have carved into us. I hadn't responded to the letter because my therapist had advised against it, had explained that maintaining absolutely no contact was the healthiest boundary for both of us, but I had kept it in a drawer in my study, and sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep I would take it out and read it again, trying to understand how someone could become so lost that they would think breaking into a stranger's home and stealing their underwear was a reasonable path to belonging, trying to understand the particular alchemy of damage and obsession and distorted need that had created the situation we had all lived through, trying to cultivate some small space of compassion even while maintaining absolute clarity that what she had done was wrong and violated and profoundly destructive to my sense of safety and peace. David came and sat beside me as the gathering was winding down, taking my hand in his larger one and squeezing gently, a gesture that had become his way of checking in without words, and I squeezed back, a signal that I was okay, that I was present, that I was slowly, incrementally, finding my way back to something like the woman I had been before, though I knew I would never be exactly that woman again because you cannot unknow violation, cannot unlearn the lesson that safety is more fragile than you imagined, cannot return to innocence once you have discovered that the locks on your doors and the boundaries of your private spaces are more permeable than you ever wanted to believe. That evening, after everyone had left and David had fallen asleep in front of a documentary about World War II that he had seen at least 3 times before, I went to my bedroom and stood before my closet, looking at the new lingerie I had purchased to replace what had been taken, beautiful things in silks and laces that I had chosen carefully, thoughtfully, as an act of reclamation rather than replacement, as a way of saying that I refused to let Brooke's obsession permanently colonize this aspect of my life, refused to abandon the private pleasure I took in beautiful undergarments just because someone had violated and contaminated that pleasure with her appropriation. I selected a set in deep emerald silk, new and untouched by any history except my own choosing of it, and as I changed into it I thought about how we reclaim ourselves after violation, not through forgetting but through the patient, repeated acts of inhabiting our lives again, of touching the things that were contaminated and deciding they are ours again, of walking through spaces that were invaded and declaring them sacred again through the simple act of continuing to live in them, of being ourselves with full presence and attention even when being ourselves is what made us vulnerable to someone else's damaging attention in the first place. Standing before my bedroom mirror in my new emerald silk, in my reclaimed space, in my carefully reconstructed life, I thought about how we are all so fragile and so strong simultaneously, how we can be shattered and still gather ourselves back together, how we can be wounded and still insist on beauty, still insist on privacy, still insist on the right to exist in our full complexity without having to protect ourselves behind walls so high that we lose the ability to be seen at all. And I understood that this was the work of healing, this patient, imperfect, ongoing work of remaining open enough to live fully while maintaining boundaries strong enough to protect what is most essentially ourselves. And I looked at my reflection and saw not the violated woman I had been 6 months ago but someone harder and softer simultaneously, someone who had learned what violation felt like and had decided to be generous anyway, to trust again anyway, to inhabit her life with presence and intention anyway, because the alternative was to let one damaged woman's obsession steal not just my lingerie but my fundamental right to exist in the world as myself, visible and vulnerable and absolutely determined to reclaim every single thing that had been taken from me, one silk garment, one family brunch, one act of trust at a time. It was a Tuesday morning in late February, nearly a year after that catastrophic brunch, when the package arrived at my gallery rather than at home, forwarded through so many intermediaries and legal channels that the return address was simply a post office box in Vermont with no name attached. And I knew before I opened it what it would contain because there was only one person who would take such elaborate precautions to reach me while still respecting the boundaries that had been so carefully, painfully established in the aftermath of her unraveling. I was alone in my office, having arrived early to prepare for an exhibition opening that evening, surrounded by the familiar, comforting architecture of my professional life, the clean white walls, the carefully curated photographs of past shows, the orderly desk that represented a version of myself that had nothing to do with being a wife or stepmother or victim, just Catherine Morrison, curator, professional, woman who had built something meaningful entirely separate from the domestic sphere that had been so violently compromised. And I sat holding the package for several long minutes before I found the courage to open it, knowing that whatever was inside had the power to undo some of the careful healing work I had been doing, had the power to bring back the nightmares and the hypervigilance and the checking and rechecking of locks that had finally begun to subside into something more manageable. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully made from what looked like cherry wood with delicate inlay work along the edges, clearly expensive, clearly chosen with care, and inside that box, wrapped in tissue paper so fine it was nearly transparent, were my mother's champagne slip and every other piece of lingerie that Brooke had taken, each item professionally cleaned and preserved as though they were museum artifacts rather than intimate garments, and beneath them was a letter written in handwriting I recognized from the previous communication, though this one was longer, more detailed, and carried no therapist's disclaimers or legal warnings, just Brooke's own words reaching across the distance she had put between us. The letter began with an apology that was different from the first one, less clinical, more raw, acknowledging not just what she had done but why it was unforgivable, Why no amount of explanation about her damaged psyche or traumatic childhood could excuse the calculated, sustained violation of my privacy and safety, and she wrote about how she had spent the past year in residential treatment, learning to understand the mechanisms of her obsessive attachment, learning to recognize the warning signs that had led her to target me specifically, learning to construct a self that wasn't built from stolen pieces of other people's identities, but from the difficult, unglamorous work of actually facing who she was beneath all the performance and appropriation and desperate hunger to be anyone other than herself. She wrote about how she had been following my public Instagram account, not the private one that I had locked down and purged of anyone I didn't know personally, but my professional gallery account that posted exhibition announcements and artist features, and how she had become fixated on the glimpses of my life that appeared in the backgrounds of those carefully composed photographs, the corner of a room visible behind a painting, the reflection of a window showing the brick buildings of Beacon Hill, the casual elegance that seemed to permeate everything I touched, and how she had begun to research me obsessively, finding out where I lived, learning my routines, befriending Rosa at the grocery store with a performance of sweetness and vulnerability that she now recognized as manipulative, even if it hadn't felt manipulative at the time, because she had convinced herself that getting close to me was somehow the key to becoming a person worthy of love and attention and regard. She wrote about meeting James at a networking event that she had only attended because she had discovered through her research that he sometimes went there, about deliberately targeting him not because she had any real interest in him as a person but because he was a means of access to me, a way of entering my orbit that seemed more legitimate than simply breaking in, though of course she had been breaking in all along, had been using the keys Rosa gave her to enter the house when no one was home, had been spending hours in my bedroom touching my things and trying on my clothes and taking photographs that she posted carefully to her Instagram with angles that wouldn't reveal she was in someone else's space, constructing an entire influencer persona from the stolen materials of my life while telling herself that this was somehow research, somehow admiration, somehow a form of flattery rather than a profound violation of boundaries that any healthy person would have recognized as absolutely unacceptable. She wrote about the moment when Maya had discovered the Instagram photos and everything had come crashing down, about how she had felt both relief and terror, about how part of her had wanted to be caught because the obsession had become a prison she didn't know how to escape, had become a false self so elaborate and consuming that she had lost track of where the performance ended and any authentic aspect of herself began, and she wrote about the psychiatric hospitalization that had followed, the diagnosis of complex trauma and attachment disorder and a personality structure so fragmented that she had been literally borrowing other people's identities because she had no stable sense of her own, and how the long, painful process of treatment had required her to face not just what she had done to me but why she had been capable of doing it, what had been broken in her so profoundly that violating a stranger's most intimate spaces had seemed like a reasonable path to healing her own brokenness. The letter went on to say that she was writing not because she expected forgiveness, she was clear that she neither expected nor deserved that, but because her therapist had suggested that part of her recovery required her to fully acknowledge the impact of her actions on me specifically, to resist the temptation to abstract her violation into general terms or hide behind psychological jargon. And so she wanted me to know that she understood, as much as someone who hadn't experienced it could, understand what it must have felt like to discover that a stranger had been inhabiting my private spaces, wearing my intimate clothing, constructing a false self from the stolen materials of my real one, and how that violation had probably made me feel unsafe in my own home, probably made me question my judgment and perception, probably made me hypervigilant and afraid in ways that I hadn't been before. And for all of that she was profoundly, irredeemably sorry. She wrote that she was living in a small town in Vermont now, working at a bookstore and seeing a therapist twice a week and slowly, incrementally learning how to be a person who existed independently rather than parasitically, a person who could tolerate the discomfort of her own authentic self rather than constantly reaching for borrowed identities that seemed more appealing or acceptable or worthy of attention, and she wrote that she had deleted all her social media accounts and given up the influencer aspirations that had been built on a foundation of stolen aesthetics and appropriated lifestyles, and that she was learning to find meaning in small, real things rather than in the performance of a curated life that had no substance beneath its carefully filtered surface. The letter ended with a paragraph that I read 3 times, trying to decode its layers of meaning and intention. I am sending back everything I took from you because those items belong in your life, not in mine, and because keeping them would be continuing the violation even in their absence from you. But I want you to know that I understand if you cannot bear to keep them now, if they have been too contaminated by my touch and my obsession to ever feel truly yours again. And if that is the case, then I hope you will dispose of them in whatever way brings you peace, because you deserve peace, Mrs. Morrison. You deserve to feel safe in your own home and your own body and your own life, and I am sorry beyond words that my damage created a situation where your sense of safety was compromised. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to ensure that I never cause that kind of harm to anyone ever again. I sat with the letter for a long time, feeling the complicated tangle of emotions it provoked. Anger still, yes, but also something like relief that Brooke seemed to actually understand the gravity of what she had done, seemed to be doing the hard work of genuine recovery rather than just performing remorse, and underneath those feelings was something I hadn't expected to feel, which was a kind of grief for the girl she had been, so desperate and damaged that she had convinced herself that identity theft was a form of connection, that violation was a form of intimacy, that she could become worthy by becoming someone else rather than by doing the difficult work of becoming herself. I called my therapist from my office, something I had her permission to do when unexpected triggers arose, and I told her about the package and the letter and the complicated feelings it had provoked, and she listened in that particular way that therapists listen, without judgment, without rushing to interpretation, and then she asked me what I wanted to do with the items Brooke had returned, whether I wanted to keep them or dispose of them, or perhaps transform them in some way that would allow me to reclaim them as mine again. And I realized as she asked the question that I already knew the answer. Had known it from the moment I opened the box and saw my mother's champagne slip folded so carefully in its tissue paper. That evening, after the gallery opening had concluded successfully and the last guests had departed into the cold February night, I took the wooden box home and brought it to my bedroom, and I opened it again in private and took out each piece of lingerie one by one, holding them in my hands and remembering when I had bought them or received them, remembering the version of myself who had chosen them, the woman who had felt beautiful and sensual and deserving of beautiful things, and I decided that I would not let Brooke's obsession permanently contaminate these objects, would not let her steal from me twice by making it impossible for me to reclaim what was mine. I took my mother's champagne slip and I put it on, feeling the familiar silk against my skin, feeling the weight of memory and violation and reclamation all at once, and I stood before my mirror and looked at myself and thought about how we are all so much more resilient than we imagine, how we can be profoundly wounded and still insist on beauty, still insist on pleasure, still insist on inhabiting our lives fully rather than retreating into protective numbness. And I thought about my mother, who had given me this slip, who had died 5 years ago never knowing that her gift would become the center of such a strange and painful story, and I thought about how she would want me to wear it, would want me to reclaim it, would want me to refuse to let someone else's damage permanently colonize my relationship with beauty and intimacy, and the private pleasures that make life worth living. I kept the letter in my study, filed away in a folder labeled simply Brooke, that also contained the police reports and the therapist's communications and all the other documentation of that terrible spring, not because I wanted to revisit the trauma regularly but because I understood that forgetting entirely would be its own kind of dishonesty, its own kind of betrayal of the experience I had survived, and I thought that perhaps someday, years from now, I might take out that folder and read through it and feel something other than the residual fear and anger I felt now, might feel instead a kind of compassionate distance, might be able to see the whole story as a chapter that had ended rather than a wound that was still healing. David found me standing before the mirror in my mother's slip, and he came and stood behind me and wrapped his arms around me and said nothing, because by now he had learned that sometimes silence and presence were more valuable than words, more healing than explanations, and we stood there together for a long moment, my husband and me, in the bedroom that had been violated and then reclaimed, in the life that had been shattered and then painstakingly reassembled, and I thought about how marriage, real marriage, is not just about the beautiful moments but about the ability to stand together through violation and trauma and the slow, unglamorous work of healing, and I felt grateful for him in a way I hadn't quite felt before, grateful for his willingness to keep showing up, to keep holding space for my recovery, to keep believing that we could rebuild something beautiful from the broken pieces of what we had been. Spring came again as it always does, and the garden bloomed, and we held another family brunch on the patio with James and Sarah, who was still in the picture and seemed increasingly likely to remain there, and Maya brought her new boyfriend, a quiet, serious young man who worked as a teacher and who treated my daughter with a kindness and respect that made me want to weep with gratitude, and we sat together in the morning light eating quiche and drinking mimosas and talking about ordinary things, and I realized that I had not checked the locks on my bedroom door that morning, had not felt the need to confirm that everything was as I had left it, had not experienced the surge of panic that had characterized so many mornings in the year since the violation. I wore my mother's champagne slip under my clothes that day, a secret reclamation that no one else knew about, a private statement to myself that I was taking back every single thing that had been stolen from me, tangible and intangible. And as I sat at the table surrounded by my imperfect, complicated, beautiful family, I thought about how we survive the unsurvivable, how we heal from the unhealable, how we learn to trust again after trust has been shattered. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to keep living, enough to keep opening ourselves to connection and vulnerability and the terrible, wonderful risk of being seen. And I thought about Brooke in her small Vermont town learning to be herself for the first time. And I hoped with a generosity that surprised me, that she was finding her way toward whatever healing was possible for someone who had been that broken, that lost, that desperately in need of an identity she could inhabit without stealing it from someone else. And then I turned my attention back to my family, to the conversation and the laughter and the simple, profound grace of being alive and present in my own life, in my own body, in my own reclaimed and imperfect and absolutely precious existence. And I knew with a certainty that felt like peace that I was going to be okay, that I already was okay, that I had survived and would continue surviving whatever came next, because survival, I had learned, was not just about endurance but about the radical, daily choice to remain open to beauty and connection and joy even after you have learned exactly how much those things can cost. And I was willing to pay that price, would always be willing to pay it, because the alternative was a kind of death that had nothing to do with actually dying and everything to do with letting fear make you smaller than you were meant to be. And I had no intention of becoming smaller, not for Brooke, not for anyone. Not ever again. 3 years after the letter arrived, I found myself standing in front of a mirror in a boutique hotel in Paris, preparing for the opening of an international exhibition I had spent 18 months curating. And I was wearing a new lingerie set in midnight blue silk that I had purchased just that morning from a small shop in the Marais. And as I fastened the delicate clasp and adjusted the lace against my skin, I realized with something like wonder that I had gone through the entire process of trying on and purchasing intimate clothing without a single thought of Brooke, without any shadow of the violation crossing my mind, without the hypervigilance that had characterized such purchases for years after the incident. And I understood in that moment that I had finally truly healed, not in the sense that the wound had disappeared entirely, but in the sense that it had become integrated into the larger story of who I was rather than being the defining narrative of my existence. Maya had come with me on this trip, taking time off from her job at the nonprofit where she had recently been promoted to program director, and we had spent the past week walking through museums and eating in small restaurants and having the kind of unhurried, meandering conversations that had become increasingly rare as our lives had grown busier and more complex. And that morning over coffee and croissants at a cafe near our hotel, she had told me that she had been thinking about writing something about our experience with Brooke, not for publication necessarily, but as a way of processing what had happened and understanding how it had shaped her own relationship to privacy and boundaries, and the performance of identity in the age of social media. I think what struck me most, Maya had said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the kind of deliberate attention she brought to most things, was how the violation wasn't just about the physical theft of your belongings but about the theft of your interiority, the way she tried to appropriate not just your clothes and your aesthetic but your actual self, your way of being in the world, and how that kind of theft is so much more invasive than simple burglary because it's not just about taking things but about erasing the boundary between self and other, about refusing to accept that you were a separate person with your own autonomous existence, rather than just a template she could trace over herself. I had listened to her articulate what I had felt but hadn't quite been able to name, this sense that Brooke's obsession had been a kind of ontological violation, an assault not just on my property or my privacy but on my very existence as a distinct individual, and I had felt proud of Maya for being able to think through the experience with such clarity and insight, proud that she had emerged from it not traumatized but thoughtful, not diminished but deepened, and I had told her that whatever she decided to write I would support, would read if she wanted me to, would respect if she preferred to keep it private, because part of what I had learned was that everyone processes trauma differently and there is no single correct path to healing, only the path that works for each individual person in their particular circumstances with their particular constellation of strengths and vulnerabilities. The exhibition opening that evening was a triumph, the gallery filled with collectors and critics and artists all gathered to celebrate a show I had titled Boundaries and Belonging. which explored themes of identity and appropriation and the ways that contemporary artists were grappling with questions of authenticity in an age of infinite reproducibility and digital performance, and I knew as I moved through the crowded space that some part of me had been working through my own experience. With Brooke, through the curatorial choices I had made, through the particular artists I had selected and the way I had arranged their works in conversation with each other, creating a narrative about the complex negotiations between self and other, between genuine connection and parasitic appropriation, between the necessary porousness of identity and the equally necessary maintenance of boundaries that protected the core of individual selfhood. David had not been able to make the trip because of a major case he was litigating, but James had surprised me by flying over for the opening, bringing Sarah with him. And when I saw them enter the gallery together, I felt a rush of complicated emotion because James had in many ways become the son I had never quite believed he could be, had done the difficult work of examining his own role in the Brooke situation, and understanding how his cavalier attitude toward boundaries and his tendency to make impulsive decisions had created the conditions that allowed her obsession to flourish, and he had apologized to me more than once in the years since, not just perfunctory apologies but real, substantive acknowledgments of how his actions had contributed to my trauma, and slowly, incrementally, we had built something that felt genuinely like family rather than just the performance of family. Sarah had become someone I genuinely liked and respected, a woman with her own successful career as a physical therapist and her own strong sense of self that had nothing to do with performing for social media or borrowing anyone else's aesthetic. And watching her and James together, I could see that he had learned to choose a partner based on substance rather than surface, based on character rather than the way she reflected his image of himself. And when they had announced their engagement 6 months earlier, I had felt genuinely happy for them, had felt that this relationship had a foundation solid enough to withstand the inevitable difficulties that all long-term partnerships encounter. At the opening, a journalist from a major art publication asked me about the themes of the exhibition, about what had drawn me to questions of appropriation and identity, and I found myself telling a carefully edited version of the Brooke story, not naming her or providing identifying details but explaining how I had personally experienced a situation where someone had tried to appropriate my identity, and how that experience had led me to think more deeply about the ethical dimensions of borrowing and inspiration versus theft and violation, about where the line exists between the normal, healthy ways that we all construct our identities partially from materials we encounter in the world around us and the pathological appropriation that refuses to acknowledge the autonomy and separateness of the other person. The journalist had been fascinated and had asked probing questions about how I had recovered from such an experience, about whether it had changed my relationship to visibility and self-presentation, about whether I had considered making my professional life more private to protect myself from potential future obsessive attention, and I had thought carefully before answering, wanting to be honest but also wanting to articulate something true about resilience, and the refusal to be diminished by trauma, and I had said that yes, the experience had changed me, had made me more aware of boundaries and more careful about what I shared publicly, but that I had made a conscious decision not to make myself smaller or less visible in response to what had happened, because to do so would be to let the person who violated me continue to have power over my life, would be to accept the premise that being fully yourself in the world is dangerous and should be avoided, and I refused to accept that premise, refused to believe that the appropriate response to violation was invisibility rather than the continued, defiant insistence on existing fully and openly as myself. That night, after the opening had concluded and Maya and James and Sarah and I had gone to dinner at a small restaurant near the Seine, sitting outside despite the autumn chill because the view of the river and the lights reflecting on the water seemed too beautiful to miss, James had raised his glass and proposed a toast, saying that he wanted to acknowledge how much I had taught him about grace and resilience, about how to face violation without becoming bitter, about how to maintain boundaries without closing yourself off entirely, and he said that watching me navigate the aftermath of what Brooke had done had been one of the most powerful lessons of his adult life, had shown him what real strength looked like, not the masculine bravado he had been raised to value but the much harder, much more genuine strength of remaining open and vulnerable even after you had learned exactly how much that openness could cost. I had felt tears spring to my eyes as he spoke, not tears of sadness but tears of gratitude and recognition, gratitude that something meaningful had emerged from the terrible spring of Brooke's violation, that my family had grown closer rather than fracturing under the pressure of trauma, that James had become someone capable of this kind of emotional articulation and genuine appreciation, And I had raised my own glass and said that I was grateful to all of them for standing with me through the worst of it, for believing me when I said something was wrong even before I had concrete evidence, for helping me rebuild my sense of safety and autonomy, for showing me that family at its best is not just about the good times but about the willingness to witness each other's pain and help carry the weight of difficult experiences until the burden becomes bearable. The next morning, Maya and I took a walk through the Luxembourg Gardens, the leaves turning those particular shades of gold and russet that Paris autumn specializes in, and she told me that she had been thinking about something Brooke had written in her letter, the part about how keeping the stolen items would have been a continuation of the violation, and Maya said that she thought there was something profound in that recognition, something about how genuine recovery requires not just the cessation of harmful behavior but the active work of repair and restitution, and she wondered aloud whether our culture's approach to trauma and harm was sometimes too focused on punishment and not focused enough on the difficult, unglamorous work of actually repairing what has been broken and helping people rebuild what was destroyed. I told her that I had thought about this question a great deal in the years since the Brooke incident, that I had wrestled with my decision not to press charges, had wondered whether I had made the right choice in accepting her parents' request for mercy, had questioned whether allowing her to pursue treatment rather than prosecution was actually justice or whether it was just conflict avoidance disguised as compassion, and I said that I still didn't have a definitive answer, that I thought perhaps there was no single right answer but rather a series of choices that each person in such a situation has to make based on their own values and needs and capacity for engaging with the complexities of harm and healing. Maya had listened with that quality of focused attention that was one of her most beautiful characteristics, and then she had said something that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. I think what you did, Mom, was choose to believe that people are more than the worst thing they've ever done, that they're capable of change and growth even after they've caused serious harm, and that's not the same as minimizing what happened or pretending it wasn't a violation, but it's a way of holding space for the possibility that she could become someone different, someone better, someone who would never do that kind of harm again, and I think that's actually a really radical form of hope, to believe in the possibility of transformation even for someone who hurt you so badly. We walked in silence for a while after that, and I thought about Brooke in her small Vermont town, wondered if she was still working at the bookstore, wondered if she had managed to construct a stable sense of self that didn't require appropriating other people's identities, wondered if she ever thought about me and about the damage she had caused and about how strange and terrible and somehow also redemptive the whole experience had been, and I realized that I hoped she was okay, hoped she had found some measure of peace and healing, hoped that the difficult work of treatment had given her tools for living a life that didn't require stealing from others to feel whole, and this hope felt like a gift I was giving not to her but to myself, a way of refusing to carry the weight of bitterness and anger indefinitely, a way of choosing to believe in the possibility of repair even when complete restoration was impossible. Before we left Paris, I bought myself one more piece of lingerie, an exquisite set in pale rose silk from a designer boutique near the Palais Royal, and as the saleswoman wrapped it in tissue paper and placed it in a beautiful box I felt no anxiety, no hypervigilance, no shadow of past violation, only the simple uncomplicated pleasure of choosing something beautiful for myself, and I understood that this was what healing looked like. Not the erasure of what had happened but the gradual, patient work of rebuilding a life where beauty and pleasure and vulnerability were possible again, where I could inhabit my own existence without constantly looking over my shoulder, where I could be fully myself without fear that someone would try to steal that self and wear it like a costume. On the flight home, somewhere over the Atlantic, I took out my phone and scrolled through my professional Instagram account, looking at the recent posts about the Paris exhibition, and I saw in the comments section a message from an account I didn't recognize, and when I opened it I saw that it was from Brooke, or at least from someone claiming to be Brooke, though the account was private and had only a handful of followers and no posts, and the message said simply, "I saw the article about your exhibition and I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you for not letting what I did make you smaller or less visible, and I'm sorry again for everything, and I hope you know that the work you're doing in the world is important and beautiful and I'm grateful that you exist even though I went about expressing that gratitude in the most destructive way possible. And I won't contact you again after this because I know that maintaining boundaries is crucial for both of us, but I wanted you to know that I'm still doing the work, still learning to be myself, still trying to build a life that doesn't require stealing from anyone else. And I hope you're well and I hope you stay well, and I hope you know that what happened wasn't your fault, and you didn't deserve it, and you were right to be as angry as you were." I read the message 3 times, feeling the familiar complicated tangle of emotions it provoked, and then I did something that surprised myself. I wrote back, not a long message but just a brief acknowledgement, saying that I appreciated her reaching out, that I was glad she was continuing with her treatment and her work of building an authentic self, and that I wished her well in her ongoing recovery, and then I blocked the account because I knew that maintaining the boundary was important even as I acknowledged her effort at connection, and I felt somehow lighter after doing this, felt that I had found a way to honor both my need for protection and my capacity for compassion, both my right to boundaries and my recognition of our shared humanity. David picked us up from the airport, and during the drive home through the familiar streets of Boston I told him about the message from Brooke and my decision to respond briefly before blocking her, and he was quiet for a moment before saying that he thought I had handled it perfectly, had found a way to be kind without being foolish, generous without being naive, and he reached over and took my hand and said that he was constantly amazed by my capacity for holding seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously, for being both wounded and whole, both cautious and open, both changed by trauma and fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered most. That night, in our bedroom, in the space that had been violated and then reclaimed, I unpacked my suitcase and carefully placed my new rose silk lingerie in my drawer alongside all the other beautiful things I had collected over the years, including my mother's champagne slip and the other items that Brooke had returned, and as I organized everything with the kind of care and attention that these objects deserved, I thought about how we are all, in the end, just trying to construct lives that feel authentic and meaningful, trying to build selves that we can inhabit with some measure of comfort and pride, trying to find ways to connect with others without losing ourselves or violating them, and I thought about how difficult that work is, how easy it is to make mistakes, how some mistakes are small and forgivable and some are large and devastating, and how the challenge is to learn to tell the difference, to know when to extend grace and when to maintain boundaries, when to offer second chances and when to walk away permanently. I stood before my mirror in my new rose silk, and I looked at myself with eyes that were kinder than they had been 3 years ago, less judgmental, more accepting of imperfection and complexity, and I thought about the exhibition I had just opened in Paris, about the questions of identity and appropriation and belonging that it explored, about how my personal experience had become transformed into something larger, something that could speak to others who had experienced their own versions of violation and survival, and I felt grateful for this transformation, grateful that meaning had emerged from suffering, grateful that I had been able to take something terrible and alchemize it into something that might help others understand their own experiences more clearly. Maya texted me before I went to sleep, saying simply, "Thank you for taking me to Paris, for sharing your triumph with me, for showing me what it looks like to turn pain into art and trauma into wisdom. I love you more than I can say." And I felt my throat tighten with emotion as I read her words, felt the fierce protective love that mothers feel for their daughters mixed with the pride of seeing her become someone so thoughtful and articulate and capable of deep feeling. And I typed back, "You are the best thing I ever made, the most important work of my life, and I'm so grateful that we get to witness each other's growth and healing and becoming." And then I turned off my phone and lay down beside David in our reclaimed bed in our reclaimed room in our reclaimed life, and I fell asleep thinking about boundaries and belonging, about violation and healing, about the long, patient work of remaining human in a world that sometimes makes humanity feel impossible, and about how we survive, how we endure, how we insist on beauty and connection and joy even after we have learned exactly how fragile all those things are, and how that insistence, that refusal to be diminished, that determination to keep living fully and openly despite everything, is perhaps the most profound form of courage any of us can muster. And I had mustered it, was mustering it still, would continue mustering it for as long as I drew breath, because I had learned the hard way that the alternative to courage is a kind of death in life that has nothing to do with actual dying and everything to do with letting fear dictate the boundaries of your existence. And I refused that fate, rejected it completely, chose instead the messy, complicated, risky business of staying open to the world and to myself and to the possibility that tomorrow might bring something beautiful even though today had brought something terrible. And in that choice, made daily and hourly and sometimes moment by moment, I found not happiness exactly but something deeper and more durable, something like peace with the knowledge that I was fully, authentically, unapologetically alive.